So I've been working in emergency medicine for pretty much 10 years, and most of the emergencies I treat in the A&E aren't really emergencies. They are the endpoint of something that has been building very slowly for years and years. And right now, there is a crisis unfolding in the Middle East that is going to make that problem significantly worse, and almost nobody is talking about it. So, the Strait of Hormuz, a tiny thin strip of water around 33 kilometers wide at its narrowest point, sitting between Iran and Oman. And right now, as you watch this, somewhere between a fifth and a quarter of all the oil traded around the world is supposed to pass through that tiny gap. Supposed to, because at the moment, that's obviously not happening. Now, regardless of why it started or who's to blame or who started it, the whole thing at the moment has come to a standstill. Ships are basically just sat waiting. Insurers are pulling out. Tankers are rerouting thousands of miles, adding weeks to journeys and billions to costs. And what most people watching the headlines don't realise, because obviously the headlines are focused on missiles and bombs and negotiations and ceasefire talks, is that the actual story, obviously secondary to the humanitarian crisis, the one that will affect your life and your health, is quietly playing out in the background, in supply chains, in fuel prices, in government budgets, and eventually in hospitals. Now, I want to be honest with you about what this video is and what it's not. This is not a geopolitical analysis. I am not smart enough for that. I am just a doctor. I am not a diplomat. What I am, though, is somebody who has spent years in emergency medicine watching what happens to people when systems get stretched. And if you work in the NHS, you experience this every day. You experience what happens when ambulances take longer, when your scan is delayed, when the medication is backordered and you have to go a week without taking your meds, when the appointment that should have happened 6 months ago finally happens but far too late. And what I've learned, both in the department and from the research, is that healthcare systems don't collapse dramatically and suddenly. They don't go from fine to broken overnight. They erode very slowly and quietly until the people who most need them find that they can't access them in the way that they're used to. Now, before I get into the substance of this video, I just want to tell you the single most important thing that this entire video is about, because everything else flows from it. And that is that the people who live to 90 or 100 in genuinely good health, not dependent on a long list of medications and not shuttling between specialist hospital appointments, not managing one chronic condition after another, these people almost universally had very little contact with their healthcare system throughout their lives. Not because they were lucky or they had good genes, but because they didn't develop the diseases that bring most people into regular contact with doctors and hospitals in the first place. And that is the central idea here. If you're in your 40s or 50s and you're already taking multiple medications for chronic conditions like hypertension or diabetes, or for your cholesterol, then statistically speaking, your trajectory looks very different from somebody of the same age with none of those things. And that is not a judgment, that is just what the data shows. And the reason I'm talking about this at the beginning rather than at the end is that everything else I'm about to share with you about Iran and energy markets and healthcare system strain is really just the context for this one idea. And that is that the most powerful thing that you can ever do for your long-term health is to reduce your reliance on the healthcare system. Not avoid it when you need it, but genuinely, through prevention, not need it as much to prevent the diseases that we see every day in the emergency room. That is what this video is about. So to understand why a conflict in the Middle East ends up affecting waiting times at your local hospital, we need to understand what the Strait of Hormuz actually does. Think of it like this. So the global economy runs on energy, and a huge proportion of that energy, particularly oil and liquefied natural gas, has to physically travel through this one tiny narrow bottleneck to get from the Persian Gulf to the rest of the world. We're talking about shipments heading to Europe and Asia and North America. Countries like Japan and South Korea get around 70% of their oil through that strait. And European nations that are already pretty energy stressed because of what's happening in Russia and Ukraine get significant portions of our energy from these Gulf producers. And when that route is disrupted, whether by military action or insurance pullouts, or by the threat of drone strikes on tankers, or simply the uncertainty that makes shipping companies unwilling to send their vessels through it, the effects don't stay in the Middle East. They radiate outwards, and they do it fast because energy is the input cost for almost everything else that runs in the world. When energy gets more expensive or less predictable, transport costs go up, manufacturing costs go up, food costs go up, pretty much everything goes up. And governments, already carrying enormous post-pandemic debt, suddenly have to make very difficult choices about where their money goes. And one of the things that quietly gets squeezed every single time this happens is healthcare. Now, there is a piece to this that most people have never really fully considered, and it's worth just pausing on for a moment. So, pharmaceutical supply chains are deeply, deeply globalized. The generic medications that hundreds of millions of people in the West depend on, like metformin or statins or blood pressure drugs, are largely manufactured in India and China using raw chemical ingredients that are themselves energy intensive to produce and expensive to ship. When energy costs spike and freight costs rise, the cost of manufacturing and distributing those medications rises with them. Drugs that were reliably available become backordered. Drugs that were affordable become more expensive. It's just one of the most direct and underappreciated pathways between a crisis in the Persian Gulf and a person standing at the pharmacy counter being told that their prescription isn't in stock. And this isn't just hypothetical. We've seen this happen numerous times recently. We've seen it in COVID. We've seen it during the energy crisis at the start of the Russia-Ukraine war as well. The mechanism is real and it's established, and it's being stress tested again right now, and who knows where this is going to go. Now, most people assume that healthcare budgets are somehow protected, that they are ring-fenced, that governments will never touch them. And publicly, that's usually the message that politicians try to give out. But what actually happens during these economic shocks is more subtle and more damaging than an outright cut. And it happens so gradually that by the time people notice, the damage is already done. Inflation eats into fixed budgets. Staff costs rise because nurses and doctors and paramedics are living in the same inflationary environment as everybody else, and they need pay rises to keep up. And those pay rises cost money that the system doesn't have. Capital spending gets frozen as well. So the new MRI scanner, the hospital wing expansion that has been planned for 10 or 20 years, the IT upgrade, those all get pushed back. Hiring slows down as well, which means the existing staff have to work harder and they burn out faster and they eventually leave, which makes the problem even worse. Now, none of this makes the front page. None of this feels like a crisis in the moment. But the cumulative effect over a year or two is a system that is meaningfully less able to look after you than it was before the crisis began. And here's the thing, you probably won't notice this happening until the moment you actually need the system, until the appointment you need isn't available, until the medication costs more than you can manage, until the scan that might have caught that cancer early has now been delayed by 6 months and is now untreatable. And the thing is, we've actually got a track record here, and it's worth going through this because the pattern is remarkably consistent and remarkably easy to miss while it's happening. So the 2008 financial crisis is probably the clearest example. So in the years that followed that, countries across Europe implemented austerity programs, and the healthcare data from that period is really, really striking. So studies looking at Greece and Spain and Portugal, and yes, the UK as well, showed increases in preventable mortality, rising suicide rates, delayed cancer diagnoses, and a measurable deterioration in health outcomes that tracked really closely with the depth of the budget cuts. A major analysis published in The Lancet showed that for every percentage point rise in unemployment, there was a measurable increase in cardiovascular mortality. Now, these aren't just abstract statistics that we should just ignore. These are people who had had heart attacks and didn't get the right treatment in time, or who had treatable conditions that became untreatable because of delayed diagnoses. And the really important thing to understand here is that none of this showed up immediately. The financial crash happened in 2008. The health consequences were being measured in 2011 or 12 or 13. The deterioration was really slow. It was steady. It was almost invisible while it was happening. Now, life expectancy improvements in the UK, which had been ticking upward for decades, they stalled, and in some populations, they briefly reversed during that period, and most people had no idea it was happening. Now, COVID, which God, everybody can remember, and it still feels like yesterday, COVID was very different, and it's worth separating that one out because COVID showed us what a very rapid system collapse looks like rather than a slow erosion. Now, when the pandemic hit, the health impact was almost immediate. I'm sure all of you can remember how bad that was. People were avoiding hospitals out of fear. GP appointments became almost impossible to get. Elective or planned procedures were cancelled overnight. Cancer screening programs shut down across entire countries for months. And because the collapse happened so fast, the consequences came fast as well. Cancer diagnoses dropped off a cliff in 2020 because people weren't being screened and weren't presenting to their doctors as they usually would. We're now seeing survival rate data from that period, and it confirms what everybody feared. Outcomes got dramatically worse, and it will take years to fully quantify that. Now, COVID was horrifying precisely because everything happened in plain sight, quickly enough that people could connect cause and effect. A crisis in March and a collapse in healthcare by April, measurable consequences by the following year. What makes something like the Iran energy crisis or the 2008 financial crash so much more insidious is that the mechanism is far slower. Nobody announces that life expectancy is falling. Nobody puts out a press release saying that cardiovascular outcomes worsened this year because of what happened to oil prices. It just happens. It happens very quietly in the background over years. People get sicker a little more slowly than they otherwise would have. People wait a little longer for diagnoses. Medications get a bit harder to access. And the cumulative effect of all those different things compounded across an entire population over 3, 4, or 5 years is a measurable shortening of life for the people who are most vulnerable. It goes almost entirely unnoticed while it's actually happening. That's what makes it so dangerous. And then we've got the energy shock of 21-22, driven partly by the pandemic recovery, but then obviously massively driven also by what happened in Ukraine. European governments spent massive amounts of money propping up energy prices for households and businesses, which came directly out of the fiscal capacity that could have been spent on other things, including healthcare. The UK alone spent over £60 billion on energy support schemes around that time. And that money had to come from somewhere. And it came partly from the system that people depend on when they get ill. What makes this current crisis in Iran feel more concerning than the previous shocks is the convergence of timing. We're not going into this from a point of strength. Western healthcare systems are still dealing with the post-pandemic backlogs. The NHS is still on its feet. Interest rates rose sharply in response to inflation, and governments are now servicing much larger debt piles than they were in 2019. Now again, the NHS, to use the most obvious example, is dealing with a workforce crisis, a capital crisis, and a demand crisis all at the same time, all while doctors are on strike again. The same is broadly true of healthcare systems across Europe, and in some way the US as well, where the issue is less about government funding and more about what happens to insurance premiums and drugs prices and hospital costs when energy and inflation ripple through an already expensive private system. Another massive economic shock landing now doesn't land on a system with reserves. It lands on a system that is already running on empty, or beyond empty if you talk about the NHS. And the compounding effect of that, a second hit on an already weakened system, is where the real risk lies. Which brings me on to something that I think is really important to understand and that most people haven't really fully appreciated. So there are actually two separate mechanisms at work here, and they run completely alongside each other. So the first mechanism is the one that I've already described, which is the system level effect. Like longer waits, more expensive prescriptions, understaffed departments, delayed diagnoses. The healthcare that exists becomes harder to access and less effective. But running parallel to that, and in some ways more powerful at the individual level, is a second mechanism. When oil prices spike, transport costs go up. When transport costs go up, food prices go up, and this matters enormously for health because when people are financially squeezed, the first thing that changes very often is diet. Processed food gets relatively cheaper because there is such a markup on it. Fresh produce gets relatively more expensive. Now, people under financial stress end up eating worse, they sleep worse, they exercise less, they drink more, and they're more likely to miss medications that they can't afford. There is a very well-established body of research linking financial hardship directly to poor health outcomes, not just because of reduced healthcare access, but because of the direct physiological effects of chronic stress on the body. Elevated cortisol, persistent inflammation, disrupted metabolic function, impaired immune response. So what you end up with is a two-sided problem running at the same time. The healthcare system becomes less able to treat people, and simultaneously those same people under financial pressure, under stress, that are eating worse and sleeping worse, are becoming more unwell. More people getting sicker, fewer resources to treat them when they do. And that is a very quiet catastrophe that global crises actually enable. And what's happening right now in Iran in slow motion is the background of the news cycle. Now, it's worth saying that not all conditions and diseases are equally vulnerable to this sort of systemic pressure, and it's worth being really specific about which ones are. The diseases that suffer the most when healthcare systems are strained are the ones that benefit most from early intervention. Now, cardiovascular disease is the most obvious one. Heart attacks and strokes are very time-critical emergencies. The difference between a good outcome and a catastrophic one or death is literally measured in minutes, not hours or days. But equally important is all of the upstream management that happens before those events. So blood pressure control, blood sugar management, medication reviews as well. When primary care becomes harder to access, when GP appointments stretch out from 2 weeks to 2 months, people arrive at their cardiovascular emergencies in a worse underlying state. There's more damage happening, it's harder to recover, they are more likely to die or be permanently disabled. And the research on these points is completely unambiguous, we cannot argue with it. Populations with worse access to primary care have significantly worse cardiovascular outcomes, and the effect size is massive. Metabolic disease, so things like prediabetes and type 2 diabetes, fatty liver disease, insulin resistance, this is the slow burn version of the same problem. These conditions are driven heavily by lifestyle. They are highly reversible in their early stages, and they become enormously expensive and damaging if they're allowed to progress unchecked. Now, when you add financial stress and a worse diet and reduced physical activity and poorer sleep and less frequent medical monitoring all at the same time, which is exactly what happens in these sorts of crises, the conditions don't just stay the same, they actively get worse. Blood sugar creeps up, liver fat accumulates, insulin resistance gets worse as well. And the person living through all of this might not notice in the day-to-day because the deterioration is so gradual. Until it isn't. Until the neuropathy starts in the hands or the feet, or until their kidney function starts declining, or until a cardiovascular event like a heart attack or a stroke actually happens. By which point, the metabolic disease that was eminently sort of manageable 5 years earlier has become a serious, expensive, life-limiting condition. Now, cancer is another really obvious example here. The difference between catching colorectal cancer at stage 1 versus stage 3 isn't just about survival, it's about what kind of life that you live afterwards. So stage 1 colorectal cancer has a 5-year survival rate of over 90%. Stage 4 is around 15%. And that gap exists because of time. And a healthcare system under economic pressure does less screening. People defer presenting to their doctors, and the cancers that do get diagnosed much later. We've already seen this play out in COVID, and we will see it again if the current crisis follows the same direction as previous ones. Breast cancer, cervical cancer, bowel cancer, these are all conditions where the screening programs and the prompt investigation of those symptoms are what makes the difference between catching something early and missing it until it's advanced. Those are the programs that get very quietly deprioritized when systems are under pressure. Very quietly, without announcement, just a gradual extension of waiting times, a very slight reduction in capacity, a few more letters that just don't get sent. And then years later, the mortality data tells the story that nobody noticed while it was unfolding. Again, the reason healthcare systems are so vulnerable to economic shocks like this isn't just about funding, it is about the underlying demand. And that demand is, in very large part, a product of how unhealthy Western populations have become over the past 5 decades. Rates of obesity, type 2 diabetes, hypertension, cardiovascular disease, these have all risen dramatically over the last 50 years. In the United States, research actually suggests that a large majority of adults show at least some markers of metabolic dysfunction by standard clinical criteria, though the exact sort of figure depends heavily on which markers you use and how you define the threshold. The broader point is not in dispute. Metabolic ill health in the West is extraordinarily prevalent. In the UK, a massive proportion of adults are overweight or obese, and the prevalence of type 2 diabetes has roughly doubled since the sort of 1990s. Now, these conditions, which are not inevitable, they are largely very much preventable, are driven by environment and lifestyle, and they are enormously resource intensive. They require constant monitoring, lots of different medications, specialist referrals, hospital admissions, A&E visits, and often years of downstream complications like dialysis, amputations, heart surgery, stroke rehab, all of these sorts of things. They are the background hum of demand that keeps healthcare systems permanently under pressure, even in good times. Most of what I see in the A&E is because of metabolic dysfunction to some degree. And here's the really important thing. We arrived at this crisis, the Iran crisis, the energy crisis, the cost of living crisis, with healthcare systems that were already groaning under the weight of this chronic disease burden. The post-pandemic backlog wasn't just about COVID, it was about a system that had been stretched to capacity by chronic preventable disease long before the pandemic actually arrived. And then we got pushed beyond it. So when another economic shock hits, and this one is hitting currently because of what's happening to energy because of Iran, it isn't landing on a resilient system with slack or, with functional reserve. It's landing on a system that has been running at capacity for years, staffed by exhausted nurses and doctors and paramedics and porters and cleaners who have been working through extraordinary pressure, serving a population that is, on average, sicker than any previous generation in ways that are largely preventable. That is the structural reality underneath the headlines about the Strait of Hormuz, to do with healthcare anyway. And it means the ripple effects of this crisis will be felt far more severely and for longer than people can actually appreciate right now. Because we do not have a buffer, we have no reserve. The system has no capacity to absorb another shock without massive consequences. And those consequences, as we've discussed, show up slowly in mortality data, in delayed diagnoses, in lives that were shorter than they needed to be. This is what's at stake here. And this is why the most important question, the one I want to spend the rest of this video on, is what you as an individual can actually do about it. So let's talk about what the evidence actually tells us then, because this is where everything that's felt quite bleak so far in this video starts to shift. The flip side of everything I've just described is something really empowering, and I want to make sure it lands properly with you because it's one of the most underappreciated ideas in medicine, and it's what I talk about on this channel all the time. The people who live the longest, the people in their late 80s or 90s who are still sharp and mobile and engaged with the world, they are not, as a group, the people who had the best doctors. They are not the people who were most diligent about attending their appointments or who were on the most optimized combination of medications or supplements. By and large, they are the people who didn't develop the chronic diseases in the first place. They are the people who had the least contact with the healthcare system throughout their lives, not because they avoided it irresponsibly, but because they genuinely didn't need it in the same way. And on the most part, that is not luck, it's not genetics. The research on these people who live past 100 and on populations with exceptional longevity, the blue zones, although, there are some flaws in the data there, but by and large, the studies that look at these sort of people, we consistently see that what these people share is not access to better medicine. It's that they live in ways and eat in ways and move in ways and connect socially in ways that make these chronic diseases much less likely. Now, I need to be really clear about what I am saying and what I'm not saying. I am not saying do not go and see your doctor, obviously. I'm not saying that medication is bad necessarily or that the healthcare system is your enemy. If you have a serious condition, then please engage with your healthcare team. What I'm saying is this: if your goal is to live a long and healthy life, not just a long life managed by an increasingly complex medication regime, but a genuinely healthy long life, then the strategy that the evidence supports, at least, is preventing the diseases that bring people into regular contact with the system in the first place, not managing those diseases better once you have them. Prevention isn't just cheaper and more effective than treatment. It is, for the majority of chronic diseases that kill us, absolutely achievable. And in a world where the healthcare systems are under strain, where access is getting harder and costs are rising, reducing your biological reliance on that system isn't just a good personal health strategy, it is the most rational response to the world we're currently living in. It is the most obvious thing when you think about it. You get your car checked every single year to prevent things from happening, but we don't do that with our own bodies. So what I want to do for the rest of this video is separate this into 5 pillars, 5 things that you can focus on. And food is the first pillar. Food is the most powerful lever that most people have access to. And the research on diet and disease risk is now remarkably consistent, even though the public convention around nutrition is very confusing and noisy because of what you see online. The confusion is largely manufactured by food industry lobbying, by conflicting media coverage, by influencers telling you different things that they're paid to say, and by the sheer complexity of nutritional science. But when you strip all of that back to what the large epidemiological studies and the clinical trial data actually show, the picture becomes a lot clearer. The diets associated with the lowest rates of heart disease and diabetes and many cancers are the ones built around whole foods, predominantly plants with varying amounts of animal products and nuts and seeds, things that your great-grandparents would recognize as food. Now, the Mediterranean diet, which I talk about quite often, has the strongest evidence base of any dietary pattern for cardiovascular outcomes specifically. backed by really big randomized controlled trials, which is quite rare in this sort of research. The PREDIMED trial, and I'll put a link in the description below if you want to read more about it, showed roughly a 30% reduction in major cardiovascular events in people assigned to a Mediterranean diet compared to a control group. But what does that actually mean in practice? Well, it means extra virgin olive oil and vegetables and legumes and whole grains and fish and nuts. Lots of roughage and fibre with good protein and good fats is how I like to describe it. Now, ultra-processed food in particular is getting a lot of research attention right now. It's all over YouTube, which is clearly a good thing. And the findings on this research are not ambiguous. Higher ultra-processed food intake is associated with higher rates of obesity and type 2 diabetes and cardiovascular disease and depression and just all-cause mortality across the board. A 2024 meta-analysis in the BMJ, the British Medical Journal, looking at data across millions of people, found consistent dose-response relationships between ultra-processed food consumption and poor health outcomes. And it's probably a combination of the nutritional profile, the effect on the gut microbiome, the disruption of these appetite-regulating hormones, and the presence of various additives like nitrates and nitrites and preservatives and emulsifiers, all these different things that, we don't recognize as food. But whatever the mechanism, this signal is incredibly clear. Whole foods are protective. Now, the second pillar is all about movement and exercise. Now, exercise is one of those things that sounds pretty obvious to most people. Everybody knows exercise is good for you. But the scale of the benefit is massively underappreciated, even by doctors. So regular physical activity is probably the single most studied intervention in all of preventative medicine, and the evidence for its impact on cardiovascular disease and type 2 diabetes and depression and your cancer risk and your all-cause mortality again is absolutely extraordinary. A landmark analysis published in The Lancet in 2012 estimated that physical inactivity was responsible for 6% of coronary heart disease globally, 7% of type 2 diabetes, 10% of breast cancer, and 10% of colon cancer, just from inactivity. Figures that put it in the same league as smoking as a cause of preventable death. Now, more recent work has refined our understanding of what dose of exercise actually matters. The good news here is that you don't need to be running marathons or doing triathlons. The largest survival benefit from physical activity actually comes from moving from completely sedentary to doing even moderate amounts of activity throughout your day. A study using accelerometer data from the UK Biobank showed that just 11 minutes of moderate intensity activity per day was associated with a 23% lower risk of cardiovascular disease and a 16% lower risk of cancer. Now, obviously the returns diminish as you do more, but they don't disappear. And strength training as well, which I talk about all the time, and has a rapidly growing evidence base, is consistently associated with a lower all-cause mortality, better metabolic health, and preservation of muscle mass as you get older, which is one of the strongest predictors of healthy aging that we have. Basically what it comes down to, and yes, it's not as simple as this, but try to move more and sit less and do some resistance work where your muscles are actually working. The specific form of exercise matters much less than the consistency. The main thing is trying to do something every day if you can. And I want to connect this back to something that I see all the time in A&E. The patients who come in with their first serious cardiovascular event like chest pain at 58 or stroke at 63, these aren't people who had lived dramatically unhealthy lives. These are people who had just gradually moved a bit less, eaten a bit worse, slept a bit shorter, year on year, without ever noticing the accumulation. Remember, the body doesn't send a warning light like you get on the dashboard. It just quietly becomes more vulnerable. And then one night, it tips over the edge. We see this all the time. The third pillar is all about your sleep. Now, sleep really is the neglected pillar of health. And it's neglected partly because it doesn't really feel like an active choice in a way that diet and exercise do. it feels, well, quite passive, like a bit optional, something that you can catch up on at the weekend. But the biology says something very different. So sleep is the period in which your body does an enormous amount of active repair. It consolidates memories, it cleans metabolic waste from the brain, it regulates your hormones, it repairs your tissues, it calibrates your immune function. When you consistently sleep less than 7 hours, the physiological consequences are really measurable and serious. We know that short sleep duration is associated with higher rates of obesity, partly because of the disruption to ghrelin and leptin, which are the hormones that regulate your hunger and satiety, and it's also associated with higher rates of type 2 diabetes through its effects on insulin. This comes from somebody who used to work permanent night shifts in the A&E. We know that short sleep is associated with hypertension, with elevated inflammatory markers, with impaired immune function, and higher rates of cardiovascular events. And the immune system effect is actually really interesting. It's worth pausing on for a second. So there was a study published in Sleep, and it found that people who were getting 6 hours or less were 4 times more likely to develop a cold compared to those who were getting at least 7 hours. Now, from a mental health perspective, the bi-directional relationship between sleep and mood is one of the best established findings in psychiatry. Poor sleep worsens anxiety and depression. Anxiety and depression worsen sleep, and the cycle is self-reinforcing. Now, in the context of a world that is increasingly stressful and uncertain, protecting your sleep isn't a luxury, it is a physiological necessity. Stress is our 4th pillar on this list today. Now, stress gets talked about a fair amount in different circles, but from a physiological perspective, chronic stress has very specific and well-characterized effects on the body that connect directly to the disease processes that we've already talked about. The stress response, which is the release of cortisol and adrenaline, the activation of the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, evolved for short-term threats. So run from a lion or a tiger, survive, and then recover. The problem these days in modern life is that these stresses are completely unrelenting for so many people. We're talking about financial worries, work pressure, relationship strain, the background noise of this geopolitical uncertainty. And the stress response doesn't actually distinguish between a lion and a mortgage or an argument or anxiety. When cortisol is chronically elevated for a long time, it drives fat storage, specifically visceral fat, around your organs that is really strongly associated with metabolic disease. It raises your blood pressure, it impairs your immune function, it promotes inflammation, it disrupts your sleep, it impairs insulin sensitivity as well. All of this is well documented and well researched. In other words, chronic stress doesn't just feel bad in the moment, it actively drives the diseases that make people most dependent on their healthcare system. The research on stress management as a health intervention is less clean than the data on diet and exercise, partly because it's harder to standardize and measure. But despite that, the evidence base for things like mindfulness and social connection, for time in nature and regular relaxation practices, they all point in the same direction. Managing chronic stress, which I completely understand is easier said than done. It's really easy for me to say, just manage your stress. That is for another video, I think. But managing chronic stress is not just a soft optional addition to a health plan. For a lot of people, it is a core biological necessity. The 5th and final pillar is not smoking and managing alcohol. Now, these two, for most people, I'm hoping, might feel quite obvious, but they're worth addressing explicitly because the data is still really striking, and because alcohol in particular has a very complicated relationship with how people think about it in the context of a healthy lifestyle. Now, smoking is one of the leading preventable causes of death in most Western countries. That has been established for decades, and the case doesn't need making here. But the scale of the benefit of stopping is actually massively underappreciated, and this is coming from somebody who knows a lot of smokers, a lot of them being doctors actually. Within 5 years of stopping smoking, your cardiovascular risk drops dramatically. Within 10 years, your risk of lung cancer is roughly half what it would have been had you not stopped smoking. The body's capacity to recover from decades of smoking damage is genuinely remarkable, and it is never too late to stop. My grandmother, my nan, stopped at the age of 85, genuinely, and she was smoking 20 a day for decades. She just stopped overnight. I don't know how she did it, but she managed it. Now, alcohol is a bit more complicated. It's a bit more nuanced, partly because for a long time, the research seemed to suggest that a small amount of drinking actually had a protective effect, the so-called J-shaped curve in the cardiovascular mortality data. That interpretation has been substantially challenged in recent years. Basically, what I'm saying is that there are lots and lots of studies out there, really, really big studies, that show that no amount of alcohol is good for you. Even the glass of red wine at night isn't going to be doing you any favours. What these studies show is a dose-dependent increase in your risk of lots of different things for certain cancers, particularly breast cancer and colorectal cancer and esophageal cancer. And this risk starts at very low levels of alcohol consumption. Now, that's not to say that the odd pint with your mates at the pub or the odd glass of wine is going to be doing you massive harm, but we've just got to be honest about what the evidence actually says. So why do these pillars actually work then? Well, together, what I've just described, so we're talking about diet and movement and sleep and stress management and not smoking or drinking, this isn't a random collection of lifestyle tips. These are things that interact with each other. They reinforce each other. Better sleep improves insulin sensitivity and it reduces your hunger, which makes dietary choices easier. Exercise reduces stress and improves your sleep quality and your mood. Reducing alcohol improves your sleep as well. Reducing stress levels reduces the cortisol-driven appetite for ultra-processed food and calorie-dense foods, anything with high levels of sugar and fat. There is a systems thinking lens through which all of this becomes coherent. Your body, remember, is a massively complex integrated system, and the inputs you give it work together to create this physiological environment that either prevents disease or one that promotes it. The chronic diseases that are most resource intensive for healthcare systems like type 2 diabetes and heart disease and the complications of obesity are not primarily genetic in origin. They are primarily driven by the interaction between a human body evolved for a very different environment and the modern Western food and lifestyle environment that we all have these days. That means these conditions are not inevitable. They are preventable. They are not your destiny. They are, to a remarkable degree, amenable to lifestyle intervention. And the earlier you intervene, the earlier you shift the environment that your body is operating in, the more dramatic the benefit. What I want to do as we get to the end of this video is address the gap that always exists between knowing what the research says and actually changing behavior, because that gap is real and it's not addressed by simply just listing the pillars again. Most people know at some level that they should eat better, they should exercise more, they should be lifting weights, they should sleep more, and they should stress less. I get it's not as simple as that. The question is how. The answer that the evidence points to, both from behavior change research and from my own experience watching what actually works in practice, is that dramatic overhauls rarely stick. The evidence on habit formation and behavior change consistently shows that very small, consistent changes, compounded over years and decades, always outperform these large, unsustainable interventions. And this isn't just sort of motivational rhetoric. We know that the biology of habit formation really does reward consistency over intensity. A 1% improvement in a dietary quality maintained every week for a year, where you improve 1% every so often, is dramatically more valuable than a 3-week juice cleanse followed by a return to your baseline. That is the framework here. It's not perfection, it's not transformation, it's just sort of marginal and consistent improvement across the pillars that matter. And just one more thing that the evidence always supports really strongly, which often gets overlooked in these sort of individual health discussions, is social connection. And I've done a few videos on this in the past, and again, it always gets a bit of pushback, but let's just be honest about it again. The data on social connection and mortality is as strong as the data on smoking. Loneliness, feeling lonely, chronic social isolation is associated with dramatically elevated all-cause mortality. And the mechanism involves many of the same pathways as chronic stress. We're talking about elevated cortisol and inflammatory signaling as well. And in an era of geopolitical uncertainty, in economic uncertainty, and increasing social fragmentation because of technology and other reasons, investing in community and connection isn't a soft add-on to a health plan. It is, by the evidence, absolutely essential for most people. And it's one of the most powerful things that you can do for your long-term health. And if you want to learn a bit more about this specifically, then there is a video on my channel that you can search for quite easily. I want to close this video on a thought that might sound a bit unusual coming from a doctor, but I think it's worth mentioning. So the NHS and Medicaid and Medicare and other social health insurance systems across Europe, these are among the most important public institutions in their respective countries. They are, at their best, expressions of a collective agreement that people should get medical care regardless of their ability to pay. And I believe in that. But those systems are under enormous and growing pressure from, just people aging, from the rising burden of chronic disease, from economic shocks, and now from this massive geopolitical instability. And I want to be really careful here. What I'm not saying is that individuals are responsible for fixing what are fundamentally massive systemic problems. The underfunding of healthcare, the failures of prevention policy, the food environment that we all live in, those are absolutely political failures and failures from these big corporations. I do not believe that these are personal failures. These foods have been designed to be addictive. But here's what's also true. So every person who doesn't develop type 2 diabetes because of how they eat and how they move is one fewer person requiring medication, requiring specialist monitoring, requiring dialysis, or maybe amputations in the future, all of these downstream consequences. Every person who doesn't have a preventable heart attack is one fewer admission into the hospital. The lifestyle changes that I've been describing don't just improve individual health, they reduce the demand on systems that are struggling to cope. In a world where these crises and shocks and wars are becoming more frequent, one of the best things that you can do for your health, one of the most protective things, is to reduce your reliance on the healthcare system. So this has been an incredibly long video today, and clearly it is very different to my usual stuff, but I thought it was worth making a video about. What I want to do at the end is just give you something practical, just a bit of a framework. So this week, pick one thing from each pillar and make it just a little bit better, just 1%, not perfect, not transformed overnight, just 1% better. So on your diet, look at what you eat in a typical day and ask where you could swap one ultra-processed item for something whole. On your movement, maybe add 5 or 10 minutes of walking to something that you already do. On your sleep, pick a bedtime and protect it for 7 days if you can. On stress, maybe identify one source of background chronic stress and take one concrete step to address it, even a tiny small step. And then on your alcohol or smoking, if you are a smoker, start the conversation with yourself about reducing it. And on social connection, try and reach out to somebody that you haven't spoken to in a while, whether that's a family member or a friend. None of these things on their own are dramatic. None of them will transform your health in a week. But if you do them consistently, and if you improve each one consistently over a number of months or years, when they compound together, they can be one of the most powerful health interventions that you ever do. This entire Iran situation, whatever happens next, whether the Strait of Hormuz actually opens, whether the conflict escalates, whether there's some sort of diplomatic resolution, this is a reminder of something really important. We live in a world of interconnected fragility. We're talking about energy markets and food systems and pharmaceutical supply chains and government budgets. They are all connected, and when one part of the system gets very stressed, the effects ripple out in ways that are really hard to predict and harder to see in real time. Healthcare sits downstream of all of that, and the single best insurance policy that you have, not just against this crisis, but against the next one and the one after that, is to be as healthy as you can be all the time. Not because the system doesn't matter, but because the more resilient you are biologically, the less you actually need that healthcare system, and the better placed you'll be to navigate whatever the world throws at you next.